Most people remember Christmas Eve as a night of warmth, laughter, and family. For David, that night would come to mark the coldest moment of his life, not because of the snow falling outside, but because of the silence inside his own home. He had come back from his part-time job, cheeks flushed with excitement, carrying gifts he'd worked weeks to afford. In his hand was a small box wrapped with care, and in his heart was the hope that this year, maybe things would be different. But as he stepped into the house and called out, "Mom, I'm home," no one turned to greet him. Ellen, his mother, continued stirring a pot on the stove, her back stiff, unmoved by the sound of her son's voice. David kept a smile on his face, willing the discomfort away. He approached the dinner table and handed Michael, his stepfather, the gift he'd chosen just for him. A mechanical watch, not fancy, but one he'd saved for with every dollar he earned delivering newspapers and working nights at the sandwich shop. But before he could explain, Michael interrupted, his words colder than the frost creeping along the windows. "You're not part of this family anymore. Why would you be giving us anything?" David's heart stuttered. For a moment he thought he had misheard. He looked at Michael, then at his mother, searching for something, maybe a hint of a joke, a crack in the harshness, but found nothing but stone. "What are you saying?" he asked, his voice small. Michael stood up, setting down his wineglass with a thud that seemed to signal something final. He approached David slowly, his tone hard. "You're 17. You should be contributing financially. I've supported you long enough. It's time you take care of your own life." David tried to protest, reminding them he was still in school, that he already helped with small bills, that he did everything he could. But Michael laughed, a dry, cruel sound. "You think those pennies mean anything? I'm not your father. I don't owe you a damn thing." Ellen said nothing. David turned to her, his voice cracking with pain. "Mom, say something, please." But when she finally faced him, her eyes were colder than the wind outside.
"If you can't manage to live here anymore, then leave," she said. "Michael has supported you for 6 years already." And in that instant, David understood. He wasn't her son anymore, not to her. David stood frozen, the warmth drained from his face, as if someone had poured ice water over his soul. He looked around the room, now dim under the yellow kitchen lights, and saw the table set for 3, but it was clear now that the third seat was not meant for him.
The box he had held so carefully, with the watch inside, was still in Michael's hand, untouched. Slowly, David turned and walked to his small bedroom, each step heavier than the last. He packed in silence, a few old shirts, a worn-out scarf, the hand-knitted lavender one he had made for his mother over the past 2 months. It was supposed to be a surprise. He still remembered buying the yarn with the little he had saved, imagining how she would smile when she saw it. But that smile never came. Backpack slung over his shoulder, gift box pressed to his chest. He paused at the doorway and looked back. "Merry Christmas," he whispered, his voice trembling. No one answered. The silence hit harder than any insult. Outside, snow had begun to fall with more urgency, covering the sidewalks, cars, and the broken heart of a boy who no longer had a place to go. He walked without direction, passing homes where laughter and music spilled out through lit windows. He ended up at a nearby park where families posed for pictures near the glowing Christmas tree. Children ran past him, giggling, their cheeks red from the cold, their hands wrapped around steaming cups of cocoa. David sat on a stone bench, the cold seeping through his clothes, and pulled out the lavender scarf he had made. "I started knitting this in October," he murmured, pressing the soft wool to his face. "But I guess she doesn't need it anymore." His voice barely carried through the wind. A young boy passed by holding his father's hand. "Daddy, why is that boy sitting alone?" he asked. The man glanced at David but kept walking. "Don't get involved, Andrew," he said. David heard it all but didn't react. He just sat there, invisible in a world that had no space for him. As the night grew colder, the crowd around the Christmas tree thinned out. Most people had already gone home to warmth and family, leaving the park quiet except for the occasional distant laugh or the crunch of snow beneath hurried boots. David sat motionless, snow collecting on his shoulders, his hair, even the scarf he now clutched like a lifeline. He watched as a couple bundled in coats played in the snow while sipping hot drinks. The girl, with curly auburn hair, noticed him. "Hey, are you okay over there?" she called, her voice filled with genuine concern. David looked up, his eyes red from the cold and everything else. He nodded silently, but his lips were too numb to form words. She took a few steps toward him, but her companion, A taller guy in a thick black jacket grabbed her arm. "Paula, it's late. Don't get involved. New York's full of homeless scammers." Paula hesitated, clearly torn, but eventually followed him. David heard her voice fading. "I just wanted to do something good on Christmas." And then nothing. Just the wind again. David didn't blame her. People didn't want to believe a kid could fall this far. But he had. And it wasn't a scam. It was his life. Midnight struck, and with it, the arrival of Christmas. But for David, it didn't feel like a holiday. It felt like the beginning of a winter that might never end. His fingers ached, his face burned from the cold, and even his thoughts began to blur. He forced himself to stand up, his joints stiff, and walked with no destination. Eventually, he found himself in front of Grand Central Station, where he had once gone with his mother as a child to admire the holiday decorations. Now it was just another place to try and survive. He saw a group of homeless people huddled near one of the entrances. A man in his 50s, wrapped in a worn trench coat, glanced up. "It's full, kid," he said gruffly. David approached slowly, voice low. "I just need a corner. I won't bother anyone." The man looked at him a moment longer before nodding. "Name's Raymond. You can sit next to me. Just don't touch my blanket." David lowered himself onto the icy floor, leaning against a pillar, backpack pressed to his chest. Raymond reached into his coat and pulled out a piece of stale bread. "Share?" David nodded. They ate in silence, two strangers with nowhere to go, finding brief comfort in knowing they weren't completely alone. That night, David drifted in and out of sleep, curled up on the cold tile of the station floor. Around him, the sound of train whistles and the low murmurs of other homeless people blended into a muffled lullaby of survival. He didn't dream. His mind was too weary for that. At some point before dawn, a loud voice shattered the uneasy quiet. "Get up! You can't sleep here!" Two police officers marched through the station, batons tapping the ground sharply. Raymond tugged David's arm. "Come on, kid. Before they drag you off to the station." They joined the slow procession of displaced people gathering their few possessions. David's backpack held the only things he had left. Some crumpled clothes, the gift he never got to give, and the lavender scarf, now slightly damp from the night. He followed Raymond out into the gray morning. The snow had stopped, but the air was still sharp enough to bite through his coat. They walked in silence toward Central Park, where a few benches offered little more than rest for tired feet. Raymond found an awning by a bookstore that gave some shelter from the wind. "You got anyone you can stay with?" he asked. David shook his head. "No one." Raymond nodded slowly and reached into his pocket, handing David a crumpled note. "There's a church kitchen on Brooklyn Avenue that gives out porridge at noon, but you gotta be early, or it's all gone." David nodded, grateful but too tired to speak. His stomach had been growling since the night before. As Raymond settled under the awning, David walked off, following unfamiliar streets and ignoring the curious stares of passers-by. He rummaged through his bag, hoping to find something edible. All that remained was a broken plastic container with soggy cookies. He ate them one tiny bite at a time, trying to make them last, though they barely registered on his tongue. That whole day was a blur of rejection and aching feet. He knocked on the back doors of restaurants, stopped by bakeries, and asked in corner stores. "I can wash dishes, sweep floors, anything," he'd say. But his clothes were too dirty, his face too worn, and every answer was the same. "Sorry, not hiring." Or worse, "Move along." Some looked at him like he was dangerous, others like he didn't exist at all. Still, he kept walking. From Brooklyn Heights to Bushwick, he moved without rest, driven by hunger and the tiniest sliver of hope. By the time he reached the porridge kitchen, the line stretched around the block. David stood quietly, shivering, his nose red, his limbs stiff. When he finally reached the front, the watery porridge and dry piece of bread felt like a feast. A woman with blonde hair and a cross around her neck leaned down to speak with him. "What's your name, son?" "David." "How old are you?" 17. She paused, her expression softening. "I'm Teresa. If you've got nowhere to sleep, come to St. Mary's Church tonight. We have a small room for youths." David's chest lifted slightly with hope. Maybe finally something was about to go right. But as with most things in David's life by then, even hope came with an expiration date. That evening, David arrived at St. Mary's just before sunset, his steps lighter than they had been all week. The old wooden doors creaked as he pushed them open, the faint smell of candles and pine still lingering from Christmas services. Teresa met him at the threshold, her face suddenly tense. "David," she said gently, I'm so sorry. A group of addicts came in earlier. We had to close the youth room for safety reasons. It's not safe tonight. Her words hit like a brick. For a moment he thought of begging, but he just nodded. He understood. There was no room, no bed, no safety. He left the church slowly, passing a nativity scene outside. The baby Jesus smiling in a manger of straw. But David had no manger. He had no place to rest. He ended up beneath the awning of a closed cafe, huddled next to the glass door, his knees pulled to his chest. The sky was letting down freezing sleet now, soaking his clothes. His only blanket was the lavender scarf, still faintly smelling of the yarn shop where he'd bought it. It wasn't enough. Later that night, a group of teenagers walked by, laughing and shoving each other. 3 boys and a girl. One of them, wearing a hoodie and chewing gum loudly, stopped and pointed. "Hey, look at this. Someone's living like a sewer rat," he said with a sneer. The others giggled. The boy walked up to David and kicked at his backpack. "What you got in here, huh? Got money?" David clutched his bag tight. "Please, don't," he muttered. But the boy didn't stop. A fist came flying out of nowhere, landing hard on David's cheek. Pain exploded across his face as he fell to the pavement. The snow now mixed with blood. "Ethan, stop it," the girl yelled, her voice shaking. "I'm just messing around, Madison," he said. But his voice had already shifted. There was no joke in it. The group finally walked off, one of them carrying the lavender scarf, the only thing David had left of his former life. He didn't cry. He couldn't. His body hurt too much, and he had already lost so much. He curled up on the cold ground, blood trickling from his mouth as the world passed by without noticing. The morning after the assault, David pulled himself up from the cold pavement, his body aching with every movement. His cheek was swollen, and the cut on his lip had dried into a dark scab. He walked to a nearby pharmacy, hoping to find a bandage or even a kind word, but the clerk barely looked at him before waving him off. "We're not a free clinic," she snapped. David turned away, his eyes stinging, not from the cold this time, but from the way people looked at him, or worse, didn't look at all. Hungry and desperate, he slipped into a supermarket, scanning the aisles until he found a neglected loaf of bread in the back of a shelf. He tucked it under his coat and made his way toward the exit, but a firm hand grabbed his arm. "Put it back and get the hell out of here," a security guard barked. David dropped the bread on the floor and ran, shame burning hotter than the cold wind that met him outside. He didn't know where to go anymore. He sat down on the steps of a building, face tilted toward a warm-lit window where a family was having dinner. The mother ladled soup. The child reached for the father's hand, giggling. David turned away. Ellen's words echoed in his mind like a curse. "My son died when your father did." He buried his face in his arms, trying to disappear into himself, but the ache wouldn't go away. The feeling of being erased, like he'd never mattered. Suddenly, a familiar voice broke the silence. "David." He looked up. It was Raymond, the man from the train station. He held out a sandwich wrapped in wax paper. "I saw you wandering around all day. Take this." David's hands trembled as he accepted it. "Thank you," he whispered. Raymond looked at him, eyes soft, despite the lines of hardship etched into his face. "Do you have a place to sleep?" David shook his head. "There's an abandoned parking garage near the old station," Raymond said after a pause. "Not safe, but it's dry." David followed him through empty streets until they reached the rusted iron gate of a rundown lot. Inside, it smelled of mold and decay. A few cardboard boxes lined the corners, serving as makeshift beds. "It's not much," Raymond said with a weary smile, "but it beats freezing outside." David laid down and clutched his backpack to his chest, the lavender scarf now gone. The chill crept into his bones, but the ache inside him was worse. Still, he closed his eyes, not to sleep, but to escape the memory of a dinner table that no longer had a place for him. That night in the parking garage, David couldn't sleep. Every time he closed his eyes, his mother's face reappeared. Not the loving version from his early childhood, but the cold, indifferent mask from Christmas Eve. Her words echoed louder in the quiet. "My son died when your father did." He turned to his side, eyes fixed on the rusted beams above, the wind moaning through the gaps like the cries of 100 other forgotten souls. Raymond snored softly in the corner, buried under layers of cardboard and worn blankets. David whispered to no one, "Is it because I'm a stepson? Is this what I was born for?" He didn't want pity. He wanted to understand why love had conditions, why survival felt like punishment. The only answer came from the bitter wind slipping through the cracks, colder than anything he'd ever felt. He stayed like that for hours, his mind spiraling into the kind of loneliness that feels permanent. But even in that hollow place, something in him refused to collapse. Maybe it was anger, or pride, or the memory of what his real father used to say when times were hard. You hold on, even if it's with bleeding hands, you hold on. 3 weeks passed in a haze of hunger, rejection, and numbing cold. New York's winter had settled in, sharp and merciless. David got up every morning before sunrise, folding the damp cardboard carefully and tucking it back into the corner, as if showing respect to the only shelter he had. Raymond was often still asleep, his breathing ragged from a lingering cold. David would cover him with the thinnest blanket they shared before stepping out into the gray dawn. On one of those mornings, he overheard a conversation at a soup line about a small restaurant on Lexington Avenue looking for kitchen help. The Taste Garden, someone had said. Owner's strict but fair if you don't mess around. It was all David needed. That afternoon, he walked the length of the city until he found it, a narrow storefront with 4 tables and a faded awning. Inside, the air smelled of garlic and broth, and behind the counter stood a stern woman with silver-streaked hair tied in a bun. "Can I help you?" she asked, not unkindly. "I heard you're hiring," David said. "I can clean, chop, do dishes, anything." "You got papers?" she asked. He lowered his eyes. "No ID, but I can work. I won't cause trouble." The woman studied him for a long moment. Then she sighed. "1 week trial. You mess up, you're out. Cash under the table. Got it?" David nodded, a flicker of something. Relief, maybe, warming him for the first time in weeks. From that moment on, David worked like someone who had been given a second life and knew better than to waste it. He arrived at the Taste Garden every morning at 9 a.m. sharp and didn't leave until after 10 p.m. No matter how tired he was, he peeled vegetables, scrubbed greasy pans, mopped floors, and hauled trash without complaint. His hands, already rough from the cold, became raw from soap and hot water, but he didn't mind. The owner, Rose, watched him quietly for the first few days. She didn't say much, but her eyes missed nothing. One night at the end of his shift, she called him into the cramped storage room. "Come help me sort these old invoices," she said, handing him a stack of faded folders. David sat cross-legged on the floor and began organizing them by date. His hands moved with practiced ease, fingers scanning through numbers, dates, and scribbled notes. "You're good at this," Rose remarked offhandedly. "Ever think of an office job?" David gave a faint smile. "I used to help my dad with bookkeeping for his business before he passed." As he flipped through another file, something caught his eye. A thin yellowed sheet with the heading Joint Property Ownership, Ellen V. Walker and Charles J. Morgan, registered May 23, 2005. His heart skipped. That was his father's full name. Beneath that were more documents, bank ledgers, apartment ownership records, and even a prenuptial agreement. David's hands trembled as he read through them. Every file pointed to the same thing. All assets had been jointly owned by his mother and biological father. Nowhere was Michael's name mentioned. No legal transfer, no claim. His stepfather had no rightful ownership over anything. "Ms. Rose, these papers, can I keep a few of them?" he asked, trying to sound calm. She looked at him, puzzled. "They were left by the old tenants years ago. I just use them to pack deliveries. If it helps you, take what you need. Just don't dig through everything." David nodded, already clutching the files like they were gold. That night, back in the parking garage, he sat cross-legged with a penlight and reviewed each document carefully. The more he read, the more he shook. His mother hadn't just let Michael control everything. She had silently let him take over what rightfully belonged to David and his late father. When Raymond stirred from his corner and asked what he was reading, David hesitated before showing him. "I think my mother and stepfather lied to me about everything." Raymond, still groggy, read through the documents. "This is real," he said. "You've been robbed, kid. Not just of your home, but of your truth." And in that moment, for the first time since that bitter Christmas Eve, David felt something other than grief. He felt purpose. From that night forward, something inside David shifted. He still returned to the Taste Garden every morning, scrubbing and cleaning like before. But now his evenings were spent at the city library. He used the public computers to research property laws, inheritance rights, and legal loopholes. The librarians got used to his quiet presence, but one of them, A young woman named Camille began to take notice. One evening, as he fumbled through online databases, she leaned over and asked, "You working on a school project?" David hesitated, then answered, "No. I'm trying to understand what rights I have when people try to erase who I am." Camille didn't pry further, but from that moment on, she saved him a spot near the warmest heater and sometimes left a cup of cocoa by his keyboard. Every day, David printed out relevant documents, bank statements, public property filings, archived court cases, and added them to a folder he now carried everywhere. That folder became more valuable than food or warmth. It was proof that he wasn't crazy, that he wasn't the useless freeloader Michael claimed he was. It was the thread tying him back to the father who had once believed in him, and the truth that might one day set him free. One afternoon, as David was wiping down the restaurant counter, Rose handed him a small envelope. "Some guy left this for you," said his name was Sean. Didn't show his face. Inside was a hastily scribbled note. "David, Michael is starting to sell off assets. He's burning through everything. Watch out." David's heart dropped. Sean was a distant cousin, one of the few people who had spoken kindly to him at his father's funeral. The note didn't surprise him, but it filled him with dread. That meant Michael wasn't just sitting on what didn't belong to him. He was actively destroying it. Somewhere across the city, in a sleek apartment Michael and Ellen now called home, Michael was barking into a phone, furious and desperate. "Transfer it now, Stephen. I'm not waiting any longer." The curtains were silk, the sofas Italian, and the wine vintage, but the walls were starting to crack. When Ellen emerged from the kitchen with flour on her hands, Michael shouted, "Where's the elevator repair invoice? I told you to pay it." She fumbled, flustered. "I left it near the microwave." "It's not there. You're always losing things," he snapped. Ellen tried to remind him it was their anniversary. He sneered, "Anniversary? We're about to lose everything." At that moment, in two very different corners of the city, both David and his mother realized something. The life Michael had built was made of sand, and the tide was coming in fast. Michael's panic escalated as fast as his financial ruin. He stormed through the apartment, waving bank notices and credit reports like they were proof of some grand conspiracy. "The accounts are frozen, Ellen. Compound interest is stacking like bricks. If we don't come up with 50 grand this month, the house is gone." Ellen collapsed into a chair, her face pale. "But the investments? You said real estate was safe." Michael laughed bitterly. "The market crashed, Ellen. It's not rocket science, and you've been spending like a queen." She protested. "Just some curtains, a kitchen remodel, a bathroom mirror." But Michael's voice thundered. "The BMW, the Rolex, the Miami trip. Who paid for that, huh?" But even he knew the answer. He just couldn't face it. Ellen stared in horror as Michael slammed a wine glass against the wall. "You want to know why we can't refinance? Because you never transferred the Maple Street property into my name. That apartment, the savings. Everything is still under your dead husband and that useless brat David." The words froze Ellen. Her breath caught. I forgot. The lawyer said to leave it that way for now. I didn't think." "Well, now you think," Michael shouted. "Sell that apartment, liquidate everything, or we go down together." Ellen shook her head, tears brimming. "That's the last piece I have of Charles. I can't." Michael sneered. "Then we both drown." Back in the shadows of the city, David kept working, quietly, deliberately. He didn't lash out, he didn't scream, he simply kept collecting. Camille, the librarian, helped him organize every document, every timestamp, every paper trail. One day she whispered, "David, the Maple Street apartment, it's been sold, illegally." His heart stopped. "By who?" "The buyer's a company under the name Michael Thompson." "But the seller? On paper, it's still your mother." David clenched his jaw. "Then he used her. Forced her, maybe." Camille hesitated. "The money didn't go into her account. It went to an offshore one. Panama. No name. But the guarantor? Shaw Morgan." David's knees weakened. "That's my cousin." The betrayal cut deep. "He was coerced? Or bribed?" Camille said gently. David looked down at his folder. "They're bleeding her dry. And blaming me." Camille touched his shoulder. "Do you want to report them?" David shook his head. "Not yet." His voice was calm but steely. "I want them to fall on their own. I'll keep gathering. I'll wait." For the first time in weeks, his rage was no longer fire. It was ice. Focused, controlled, dangerous. And Michael had no idea what was coming. In the following weeks, the cracks in Michael's carefully constructed life widened into chasms. Creditors began calling relentlessly. Final notices piled on the doorstep like fallen leaves. His once slick lawyer dropped him, citing unpaid fees. He snapped at delivery drivers, cursed at neighbors, and drank more than he ate. During a trip to the supermarket, his credit card was declined. The cashier, a woman named Laura, frowned and asked if he had another card. "Try it again," he barked, sweating under his designer coat. "Sir, it's been declined 3 times. Ellen stood beside him, humiliated, her cheeks flushed with shame. "What do we do now?" she whispered. "Shut up," Michael hissed, abandoning their groceries and storming out. But worse humiliations were waiting. A week later, the electric company cut the power. 3 unpaid months. No lights, no heat. The fridge turned into a useless box of spoiled food. Then came the water company. They didn't warn them. They just came and removed the meter. That night, Ellen had to go downstairs and beg the neighbor for water. Marissa, a woman who had always kept to herself, sighed deeply. "I told you that house is burning money. Little David was the only decent one in it." Another neighbor chimed in. "Ever since he left, that place feels haunted." Ellen sat at the kitchen table that night, holding an old photo of her, Charles, and 6-year-old David. She didn't cry. Not yet. But her hands trembled. Then came a knock. 2 men in suits stood at the door. "We're here to reappraise the property on behalf of Citibank," one said. "Court order. If the balance isn't paid within 20 days, the house will be seized." Michael tried to bluster his way through, but his voice cracked. He sank into a chair, hands shaking. Meanwhile, at the Taste Garden, David was quietly finishing up his closing duties when Rose called him into the office. "David, I've been hearing things," she said. His heart tensed. "What kind of things?" "That you were disowned, that your mother rejected you, that you're involved in shady stuff." David didn't flinch. "It's true that I was kicked out, but I've never stolen, never lied. I was just left behind." Rose looked at him a long time, then placed a hand on his shoulder. "I don't care about the past. I care that you keep your word." David's throat tightened. "I won't disappoint you." That night, in the quiet of the back room, David opened his thick folder. He arranged every page in order. Inheritance, fraud, forged documents. "Everything's falling apart," he whispered, "and they don't even know why." At noon 2 days later, Ellen opened the door to find Michael stumbling through the threshold, his shirt wrinkled, his tie crooked, and the unmistakable stench of alcohol trailing behind him. His eyes were wild, his face red with rage. "Ellen, do you know what they're saying about me?" he shouted, slamming a folder onto the kitchen table. "They're calling me a fraud." Ellen flinched. "Who said that?" "The bank, the lawyers, the entire block on Wellington Avenue. They're saying the property doesn't belong to me because you never transferred the title, because you never signed the deed. Now they treat me like a criminal." Ellen stood frozen, her mouth parting in disbelief. "But you're the one who sold property behind my back? You hid everything. And who let that bastard son exist in the first place, huh?" Michael barked, his face twisted with venom. "You did." The room went still. Michael leaned in, his voice dropping to a cruel growl. "Ever since he came back, this house has been cursed. You looked at him like he was your dead husband, like you wanted him here. I fed him, I gave him a roof, and he turned around and sabotaged us." "You don't know anything," Ellen said, her voice shaking, then rising. "David never took a penny from you. He worked before and after school, hid money under his mattress just to buy me a Christmas gift. You threw him out because he couldn't pay the electric bill. Who failed whom?" Just then, a voice came from the doorway. "Ellen." It was Marissa, the neighbor, holding a bag of groceries. "I heard everything." She stepped inside. "You know your son used to sneak your laundry out to wash it himself? He brought home bread and said you bought it. He never stopped trying to protect your dignity, even when you rejected him." Ellen sat down slowly, her eyes beginning to fill. Michael sneered. "So now it's all on me? Fine. If I end up homeless, don't come crying to me." "You need to leave," Marissa said, stepping forward. "You're toxic and she needs to wake up." "Get out of my house!" Michael screamed, shoving Marissa backward. That was the final straw. "Stop it!" Ellen yelled, standing with a strength she hadn't shown in years. "I've cleaned up after your cruelty long enough. I lost my husband. I won't lose my son too." Michael stared at her, stunned. "You're still defending him?" "Yes," she said, her voice trembling but firm. "Because I'm his mother." Those words, "because I'm his mother." hung in the air like a thunderclap, reverberating through every crack in the collapsing house. Michael recoiled as if struck. Then, without another word, he grabbed his coat, muttered something under his breath, and stormed out, slamming the door behind him. Ellen stood frozen for a moment, the silence deafening. Marissa moved closer and put an arm around her. "You did the right thing," she whispered. Ellen nodded slowly, but her eyes stayed on the door. 2 days later, the backlash began. Rumors spread through the neighborhood like wildfire. David was a drug addict. David stole from his mother. David was kicked out for violent behavior. The first person to hear them was Rose. One evening, after the restaurant had closed, she called David into the kitchen. "Someone came here," she said. "Claimed to be a relative. Said you were dangerous." David didn't have to guess. "Michael," he muttered. Rose gave him a look that was both stern and worried. "David, if any of this is true." He didn't let her finish. Instead, he opened his backpack, pulled out the thick folder, and laid it on the table. Inside were all the documents he had gathered: the property titles, the fake power of attorney, the offshore transfer records. Rose sifted through them slowly, frowning. "I don't understand most of this," she said, "but I can see it's not made up." Her voice softened. "You're not lying, are you?" David shook his head, eyes glassy but steady. "I've never lied. I've just been trying to survive." She placed the folder back in his hands. "You can keep working here, but be careful. When cruel people feel cornered, they'll bite anything that gets too close." Rose was right. The very next day, David tried to rent a room at a low-income boarding house. The landlord asked for his name, then stared at him with narrowed eyes. "David Morgan," he said, then handed back the ID. "Sorry, room's taken." As David stepped outside, he saw a familiar figure leaving the building, Michael giving him a smug, triumphant nod. Later that week, 2 more restaurants turned him away. "We don't hire people with theft records," one manager said flatly. "I don't have a record," David protested. "Please, don't cause trouble," the man warned, waving him away. With each rejection, the city seemed to shrink around him, the walls closing tighter. Truth didn't matter. Rumors did. And Michael was poisoning every place David tried to breathe. Feeling cornered and out of options, David returned to the library and found Camille organizing books at the front desk. When she saw the look on his face, equal parts exhaustion and quiet desperation, she set everything down immediately. "What happened now?" she asked. David's voice was low, controlled, but each word cut like glass. "They're destroying my reputation. I can't rent a room, can't get hired anywhere. He's turning me into a ghost." Camille frowned, motioning him to follow her into the staff break room. "We need a plan," she said. "Something that'll clear your name, but more importantly, stop him from burying you further." David shook his head. "No more hiding, no more waiting. I'm going to expose him." He opened the folder and turned to the final page, a page he hadn't dared touch until now. It was a detailed report with dates, bank transfers, legal inconsistencies, and forged statements. At the bottom, in clean bold letters, was the name of a law office: Lewis Anderson, specialist in finance and family law. Camille leaned over his shoulder and read silently. When she looked up, there was a new light in her eyes. Not just sympathy, but admiration. This might work," David nodded. "It has to." Meanwhile, the damage to David's name continued to ripple through the city like an oil spill. At Dream Cafe, a staff member suggested hiring David for dishwashing. The owner, Lisa Roberts, frowned. "David Morgan, isn't he the one who got kicked out for drugs? That man Michael came by last week, said David attacked someone in his family." The staff member tried to speak up, "But I've heard David's not like that." Lisa cut her off. "In this industry, rumors matter more than resumes. If we hire him, we risk surprise inspections, bad press. It's not worth it." And so the name David Morgan was quietly blacklisted, crossed out before he could even apply. When he finally found a dormitory that still had space, he submitted all his temporary documents, Camille had helped him get them, and asked to pay a month in advance. The man behind the counter, Mr. Matthew, skimmed through the file, then paused. "You're David Morgan?" David nodded, hopeful. The man slowly handed the folder back. "Sorry, we're out of rooms." David pointed to the vacancy sign still hanging above the front desk. "But it says, we don't accept people with a history of mental instability." The man interrupted softly but firmly. Management's decision. Someone from St. Mary's Psychiatric Hospital sent records. David's mouth fell open. He had never been treated there. But he didn't need confirmation to know what had happened. Someone, Michael or someone paid by him, had impersonated him and faked a report. And just like that, another door slammed shut. David walked out of the building in a daze, each step heavier than the last. The streets buzzed with life, people shopping, laughing, rushing to catch trains, but he felt like he was moving through water, invisible and unmoored. Every rejection had chipped away at his spirit, but this one cut deeper. To be labeled unstable, violent, a threat to his own mother. Those lies weren't just rumors anymore. They were being carved into official records. When he tried to breathe, it felt like the air itself resisted him. He gripped the straps of his backpack, the folder inside pressing against his spine like a secret he wasn't sure anyone would believe. As he turned the corner, a group of teenagers passed by, whispering and giggling. "Isn't that David Morgan? The guy from that article? Said he pulled a knife on his mom," one muttered. David didn't flinch. He kept walking. He had stopped trying to defend himself. No one listened. At the taste garden, Rose began assigning him to back kitchen duty only. When he brought a tray out to a table one afternoon, a woman in her 40s looked him up and down and said loudly, "I know this one. He was arrested for assault. I don't want him serving me." David turned to Rose, silently pleading for support, but she just nodded and whispered, "Back of house from now on." That night, when he returned to the parking garage, he found the entrance sealed with yellow tape and a red notice, "City eviction order, hazard zone, no entry." David stood in front of it, stunned. "Raymond?" He called out softly into the dark. No response. A security guard walked by and told him the area had been cleared out. "Everyone's gone. Probably taken to shelters, but I wouldn't know where." David nodded numbly. I left a few things in there." The guard didn't care. "Not my problem." With nowhere left to go, David walked to the steps across the street and sat down, resting his head on his knees. His shoes were soaked. His clothes smelled of sweat and defeat, and the folder in his backpack now felt like the only anchor he had to reality. That night he didn't cry. There weren't any tears left. But he wrote something on a torn scrap of paper he'd tucked into his coat. Just a single sentence. "Even if I'm all alone, I won't fall." He folded it carefully and placed it in the hidden compartment of his backpack, the same one that once held the scarf he made for a mother who stopped seeing him. The days that followed blurred into a quiet routine of survival. David stopped trying to explain himself. He avoided eye contact, avoided crowds, and walked with the kind of posture that made people instinctively move away. The whispers hadn't stopped. If anything, they grew louder. At the library, people stared longer. At the restaurant, even co-workers kept their distance. One evening, Camille approached him after closing hours. Her face was pale, eyes full of worry. "Something's happened," she said, pulling out her phone. A local news article had gone live. "David Morgan, from disowned son to community threat." The headline alone was damning, but the article went further. It included a photo of David taken from outside the restaurant, paired with vague accusations from unnamed relatives, claims of theft, rebellion, and psychological instability. David read in silence, then handed the phone back. "Michael paid them," he said flatly. Camille touched his arm. "You can't keep doing this alone." But David shook his head. "I'm not that boy from Christmas Eve anymore. Let them talk. I'm not hiding." That winter was the coldest New York had seen in years. The kind of cold that stilled everything. The rivers, the streets, even breath in midair. David could feel it in his bones, but deeper than that, he felt it in his spirit. He kept working at the restaurant, kept studying at the library, but with every step forward came another block, another closed door. One afternoon, he walked into a small cafe downtown, hoping to find part-time work. He adjusted the frayed collar of his coat and approached the counter. "Hi, I'm here about the dishwashing job," he said politely. The man behind the counter didn't even look up. "Name?" "David Morgan." The man paused, finally raising his eyes. "You're that troublemaker from Broadway, right?" David stiffened. "No, sir. I've never caused any trouble. Someone already came by, showed us news articles." "Photos," David tried to protest. "They're fake. My stepfather." But the man waved him off. "Out. I don't want any problems." David stepped outside, the wind slapping his face like punishment. He passed a bus stop where a group of children were laughing. A little girl tugged at her mother's coat. "Mommy, he looks like the man from the internet." The mother pulled her daughter away sharply, glaring at David like he was a danger. He lowered his head and kept walking. At that moment, he understood something awful but true. The world didn't need proof to turn on you. Just a story. By the time he returned to the familiar underground garage he once called home, the place had been stripped of everything. No cardboard beds, no discarded blankets, just rusted walls echoing with the silence of abandonment. He stood there, staring at the metal door sealed shut, trying to peek through the cracks like a child locked out of his own memories. A security guard emerged from the shadows. "What are you doing here?" the man barked. "I used to live here," David replied quietly. "I just need to get my things. An old friend of mine might have left something for me." The guard shook his head. "No one lives here anymore. City cleaned it out. Hazard order. Move along." "Please," David whispered, but the man had already turned away. David walked across the street and sat on the cement steps of a closed corner store, the chill of the ground seeping through his jeans. He didn't even shiver anymore. His body had grown used to this state, this numbness. His mind drifted back to Raymond. He hadn't seen him since the eviction. Had he been taken to a shelter? Was he still alive? The thought of losing even that one fragile connection gnawed at him. But like so many things in David's life, Raymond too had become a question without an answer. The following day, Camille showed up at the restaurant, her expression more serious than David had ever seen. She pulled him aside and handed him a folded letter. "Michael just sent this to Louis Anderson's office," she said. David unfolded the page, scanning each word. It was an official letter accusing David of fraud, claiming he had fabricated evidence, manipulated bank statements, and forged documents to defame his mother and stepfather. Attached was a signed statement from Ellen, backing up the allegations. "That's not possible," David said, his voice cracking. "She wouldn't. Camille looked at him gently. "I checked the signature. It's real. She might have been pressured," David. "Threatened." He stepped back, eyes wide, the betrayal ripping through his chest like a blade. She chose him. Even after everything, she chose him. Camille didn't speak. There was nothing left to say. David sat down on the edge of the alley behind the restaurant, staring at the gray sky above. "He's not just trying to erase me," he murmured. "He wants her to curse me with her own name." He looked up, jaw clenched. "What are you going to do?" Camille asked. David stood slowly. "Nothing," he said, his voice steady. "It's time they destroy themselves." The words weren't bitter. They weren't angry. They were final. That evening, David returned to Central Park, to the same cold stone bench where everything had begun on Christmas Eve. The towering Christmas tree had long been taken down, replaced by a stretch of empty gravel and fading holiday lights. He sat quietly, backpack at his feet, staring out at the spot where families once laughed and children once played. The cold didn't bother him anymore. Not because it wasn't biting, but because he no longer reacted to it. It was simply part of him now, like the ache in his chest and the dull pressure behind his eyes. After a while, a familiar voice broke the silence. "David?" He turned and saw Mrs. Marissa, the neighbor from his old building, standing a few steps away with a wool scarf wrapped around her shoulders. "I heard what Michael's saying about you," she said softly. David gave a small nod. "I know. Are you okay?" she asked. He hesitated, then answered with honesty. "I think I have nothing left to lose." Marissa didn't argue. She sat beside him on the bench and pulled a small notebook from her bag. "This belongs to your mother. Ellen left it at my apartment by mistake." David took the notebook with cautious hands. It was worn, soft at the corners. He opened it slowly. Inside were pages of his mother's handwriting, neat, organized, and unmistakably hers. Most entries were mundane. Shopping lists, appointments, reminders. But as he flipped further, he reached a passage that stopped him cold. "I don't deserve to be a mother. David never did anything wrong. But I let Michael control everything, even my heart. I was afraid of being left again. And so I abandoned the one person who would have stayed." David's hands shook as he read the words again, as if somehow they would change. But they didn't. They were there. Proof that she hadn't been blind. She had known. Marissa placed a gentle hand on his arm. "She never stopped loving you, David. She was just too afraid to act on it." David closed the notebook and held it tightly to his chest. "I'm not waiting for her anymore," he said quietly. "All I have now is myself." Marissa nodded and stood. Then stand tall, David. You've survived too much to let this world silence you now. Her voice carried no pity, only quiet pride. As she walked away, David sat for a long time, alone in the growing dark, before finally rising with a purpose that hadn't been there before. It wasn't about vengeance anymore. It was about truth. The very next morning, David made his way to the office of Lewis Anderson, the financial and family law specialist whose name had been sitting on the final page of his folder for weeks. He arrived just after the building opened, his backpack securely on his shoulders, the weight of evidence making each step feel heavier, but more certain. A young secretary greeted him. "Can I help you?" David nodded. "I'd like to schedule a meeting with Mr. Anderson. My name is David Morgan." She disappeared behind a frosted door, and after a tense 10-minute wait, a middle-aged man with graying temples and a sharp but kind expression appeared. "I'm Lewis," he said, extending his hand. "You're the one Michael Thompson has accused?" "Yes," David replied, "but I brought the truth." He opened his backpack and began placing files on the table one by one. Property deeds, forged signatures, banking transactions, digital printouts, notarized agreements. Camille stood quietly behind him, a silent pillar of support. Lewis leafed through the documents with increasing interest, his brow furrowing. When he finally looked up, his voice was firm. "This is compelling. What do you want out of this?" David didn't hesitate. "No revenge, no money. I just want them to stop destroying me." Lewis nodded solemnly. "Then I'll prepare a petition for preliminary court review, and I'll contact Michael myself." As David stood to leave, Lewis placed a hand on his shoulder. "You don't need to thank me," he said. "You just need to keep living, truly living." Those words echoed in David's mind as he stepped out into the morning light. That night, David returned to a place that had become strangely sacred to him. The overhang in front of the old library, now closed for renovations. He sat there on the cold stone, pulled out a scrap of paper and scribbled one sentence. "I am not the child who was abandoned by his mother. I am David Morgan, the one who will stand tall even if the world forgets me." He folded it carefully and tucked it into the smallest secret compartment of his backpack. It was the same one where he had once stored the lavender scarf, now long gone, but never forgotten. Under the dim yellow light of the street lamp, he sat silently, not glowing with hope, but with an unshakable determination. Spring hadn't arrived yet, but in his chest, something had thawed. The early spring light trickled through the cracked glass windows of the library as David stirred awake from a night spent curled against the wall. His body was stiff, the concrete unforgiving, but his spirit, surprisingly, felt intact, stronger even. A quiet knock pulled him from his daze. It was Camille, standing with a small paper bag and a cup of warm milk. "You slept here again?" she asked, her voice a mixture of concern and quiet admiration. "There's nowhere else," David replied simply, accepting the bag with a nod. Camille sat beside him and handed over a sealed envelope. "Open it," she said. David tore it open with trembling fingers. Inside was a formal letter bearing the seal of the United States and a heading in bold, "Full scholarship confirmation, New York University." He stared at the document, rereading each line. "Mr. Lewis Anderson wrote your recommendation," Camille explained, her eyes glistening. "They're giving you a special scholarship, designed for students with exceptional self-study achievements and disadvantaged backgrounds." David was stunned. "But I never finished high school." Camille smiled. "There's a new policy. With a strong recommendation and a placement exam, you can qualify. I printed everything you'll need." David's fingers gripped the edges of the letter like it might vanish. "Why are you helping me?" he whispered. Camille looked at him with quiet resolve. "Because you never gave up, and because you reminded me that good people don't always win. But if they keep walking, they can help goodness win." From that moment on, David dedicated every waking hour to studying. He returned to the library like it was a second home, reviewing math problems, dissecting legal essays, and poring over history books with a focus so intense even seasoned scholars might have paused to take notice. Camille supported him through it all, setting aside computer time, highlighting important sections in textbooks, and even quizzing him during breaks. One day, as David was hunched over a thick legal manual, she approached him with a curious smile. "Someone wants to meet you," she said. David looked up, puzzled. A man in a gray suit stood nearby, his face composed and analytical. "I'm Ernest Bennett," he said, extending his hand. Professor at the law faculty of Forum University. Lewis Anderson told me about you. 17, homeless, self-taught in law. I wanted to see you for myself. David stood, uncertain. I'm not the best, he said, but I won't stop learning. Not because I want power, but because I need to survive. Ernest nodded thoughtfully. We don't need geniuses. We need people who know why they're learning. David sat down again, heart pounding. He wasn't just being seen. He was being recognized. When the day of the placement exam arrived, David found himself seated in a quiet auxiliary testing room, surrounded by candidates older, better dressed, and far more confident. But none of them had his fire. He gripped his pen tightly, heart racing as the proctor gave the signal to begin. The questions were tough, designed to challenge even the brightest. But David didn't falter. Each word he wrote carried the weight of 1,000 sleepless nights, each answer drawn from memories of court documents, research hours in the library, and late-night discussions with Camille. Time passed quickly. When the proctor finally called, pencils down, David exhaled for the first time in what felt like hours. Outside, the sun had broken through the clouds for the first time in weeks. He sat on a bench nearby, shaking, unsure if what he had done was enough, but certain he had given everything he had. 3 days later, his phone rang. It was Ernest. Congratulations, David. You didn't just pass. You scored the highest on the legal essay. David sat down again, stunned. A tear rolled down his cheek, not from sadness, but from the unfamiliar feeling of validation. He had earned his place. For the first time in years, someone was saying yes. Camille handed David a new backpack the day before his first class. No more holes, no more broken zippers, she said with a smile. This is what you carry into your future. David hugged the gift tightly, unsure how to express what it meant to him. Will you still be at the library? He asked. Camille shook her head. I've been hired at the New York County Court, but don't worry. We'll see each other plenty. They didn't say goodbye. Their bond didn't need it. On his first day at university, David walked onto campus wearing a modest suit gifted by Rose and carrying a laptop donated by Camille. In his coat pocket, he kept the folded paper that read, I am David Morgan, the one who will stand tall. At first, students looked at him skeptically. He was younger, quiet, and clearly not from the same background. But when the professor asked a question in constitutional law, and David answered with clarity and depth, heads turned. A student leaned over and whispered, Which school did you go to? David smiled. The school of life. And it was true. Every hardship, every cruel whisper, every sleepless night had brought him here. Not just to survive, but to begin again. Outside of class, David took a part-time job at a small cafe near campus to help cover his basic expenses. The owner, Valerie, was an elderly woman with silver hair and warm eyes that crinkled every time she smiled. Studying law, are you? She asked as he cleaned the counter. I once dreamed of being a lawyer myself, but life had other plans. 9 siblings don't raise themselves. David chuckled. You're the first person to call me son without a trace of scorn. Valerie gave him a playful tap on the shoulder. That's because you carry yourself like someone worth believing in. Every night after his shift, David would return to his tiny rented room, a place barely larger than a storage closet. On one of its cracked walls, he taped up the only photo he had left, him as a child, standing between his mother and his biological father. He didn't look at it for comfort. He looked at it for drive. I'm starting over, he whispered to the photo. Not for you to accept me, Mom, but so I can accept myself. The lavender scarf was gone. The home he once knew no longer existed, but inside him, something stronger had taken its place. Resolve. One morning, while David was washing glasses at the cafe, the doorbell chimed. A man stepped in, tall, familiar. It was Sean, his cousin, the same one who had warned him about Michael months earlier. David, he said, walking up to the counter. I heard you got into college. Congratulations. David looked up, cautious. Thanks. Sean hesitated, then sighed. I owe you an apology. Back then, Michael threatened to sue the whole family if I didn't sign that false affidavit. I didn't know what else to do. David said nothing. He didn't need excuses. Sean continued. I want to make it right. If you ever need a witness, I'll testify. I'll tell the court everything. David looked him in the eye for a long moment. No need, he finally said. They'll collapse on their own. I just want to live in peace. Sean nodded slowly, his voice softer now. You're just like your dad. honest, but never cruel. Those words lingered in David's mind even after Sean left. His father had been many things: principled, kind, methodical. If David could grow into even half the man Charles Morgan had been, he'd be proud of the path he was on. The first month of college passed in a blur of classes, books, and new responsibilities. David threw himself into his studies with a focus that astonished his professors. In his introduction to law course, he scored the highest on the midterm, and Professor Ernest Bennett, the man who had once sought him out, approached him after class with a new proposal. "I'd like you to become a teaching assistant," he said. "You've got more real-world knowledge than most seniors, and the younger students could learn a lot from you." David hesitated. "But I'm just starting." Ernest smiled. "Exactly. You're proof that the start doesn't define the finish." That same week, the university's administration took notice of David's story and invited him to join a new initiative, an outreach program designed to help homeless youth gain access to education. At first, David was reluctant. "Why me?" he asked. "Because," Ernest said, "you're the face of what's possible. You didn't just survive. You built something from your pain." David sat with the offer for a long time. Eventually, he said, "If it can help someone like I used to be, then yes." A few evenings later, David walked through Central Park, where just over a year ago he had sat alone in the snow with nothing but a scarf and a breaking heart. Now, under the same trees and the same gray sky, he noticed a young boy curled up on the same bench he once occupied, holding a plastic bag to his chest. David approached slowly and sat beside him. "Are you hungry?" he asked. The boy nodded. Without hesitation, David reached into his satchel and handed over the sandwich and bottle of water he had packed for himself. The boy looked up at him, wide-eyed. "Who are you?" he asked. David smiled faintly. "Someone who used to sit exactly where you are." The boy didn't say anything more, but the look in his eyes was familiar, fear mixed with longing and a flicker of hope. David didn't offer false promises. He didn't talk about brighter futures. He simply stayed for a while, making sure the boy didn't feel invisible. As he walked away that night, David realized something important. He didn't need revenge to heal. He just needed to become someone who could offer the light he had once so desperately needed. 3 years later, the name David Morgan no longer appeared in whispers or rumors. It was printed in newspapers, featured in university newsletters, and spoken with admiration in lecture halls. At 20, David graduated from law school with honors, holding a diploma in one hand and a special award in the other for his outstanding contributions to underprivileged youth. Ernest Bennett, now retired, stood beside him, squeezing his shoulder firmly. "You're not just a lawyer now, David. You're a symbol of what's possible." Camille, standing in the crowd, wiped tears from her eyes. She had watched his transformation from a boy in a tattered coat to a man standing tall in a courtroom. When she hugged him afterward, she whispered, "You did it." David replied, "Thanks to you, and thanks to everyone who turned their backs on me. Without them, I wouldn't have learned how strong I really was." Valerie, now retired and living with her daughter, had also come. She held his hands and smiled. "You don't have to be born from someone's body to be their child. I didn't give birth to you, but I've never been prouder to call someone family." A month after graduation, David returned to the very house he had been thrown out of on that infamous Christmas Eve. The broker looked at him puzzled. "You sure you want this place? The financial history's a mess." David nodded. "That's exactly why. It needs to mean something different now." He purchased the Maple Street house not as revenge, but as rebirth. With the help of Camille, Ernest, and Valerie, he transformed the building into a shelter and education center for homeless teens. He named it New Light. The first night it opened, Valerie donated dinner. Camille led intake interviews, and Ernest offered free legal advice to new residents. The children who arrived were scared, silent, just like David had once been. But when they stepped through the doors, they found warmth. They found guidance. And they found David, no longer the boy no one believed, but the man who believed in them. One afternoon, while leading a workshop on job applications, the doorbell rang. David opened it to find a woman with gaunt cheeks and tired eyes, holding a worn bag to her chest. It was Ellen. She stood there frozen, voice trembling. "Son." David didn't speak. Not right away. Neither did she. Years of silence hung between them. Ellen's voice cracked as she tried to speak. "I don't expect forgiveness. I just needed to see you, to know you're okay." David stood in the doorway, not with anger, but with a stillness that came from surviving the worst and learning to rise anyway. "Where are you living now?" he asked, his voice calm. She lowered her eyes. "Nowhere. Michael left me after the investigation started. He's hiding in Portugal. The money, it's all gone. I have nothing." David nodded slowly. There was no triumph in his eyes, no vindication, just quiet understanding. He turned to a staff member nearby and said, "Get her a meal, a bed, and a chance." Ellen broke down, sobbing into her hands. "I'm sorry, David. I was weak. I let fear guide me. I let him speak for me." David replied gently, "You left me on the coldest night of the year. Today I choose to welcome you, not because you're my mother, but because I want this place to be where hatred ends." Later that evening, the center's backyard came alive with holiday lights. Children ran in circles, laughing, holding hot cocoa and paper stars. Camille brought out a new sign to hang above the door. In white letters against a blue background, it read, "Family isn't where we're born, it's what we build with kindness." As the celebration continued, Ellen stood at the far edge of the yard, watching silently. She held a small gift box in her hands and finally stepped forward. "I didn't know what to give you," she said, handing it to David, "but I reknitted the scarf. Lavender, like the one you made for me." David opened the box. The scarf was soft, every stitch made with care. He wrapped it around his neck and smiled. "Everyone can start over, Mom, if they dare to face the past and choose to be kind from this moment on." Ellen nodded, tears in her eyes. "You're the best person I've ever known, and the one I lost." At midnight, snow began to fall again, but it felt different, like a quiet blanket, not a punishment. David stood beneath the lights, surrounded by singing children and glowing candles. On the wall behind him was a bronze plaque that read, "New Light Center, where every child has the right to hope." A carved image showed David holding a child's hand, both facing forward into the unknown. Camille whispered, "You've become a light for so many." David smiled. "I'm just one small light," he said, "but in the dark, even one is enough to guide the way."